The British and French armies met at the Picardy sector north of the Somme River. This is where British commander Sir Douglas Haig would launch his joint offensive. The land was largely untouched by shellfire, making it easier for the infantry to cross no man's land, and it was relatively flat, which made it easier for the artillery to hit their targets. However, when the Germans attacked at Verdun, many French divisions had to be moved out to defend the city. The French had criticized the British for not attempting more offensives on the Western Front. There was the Battle of Loos in October 1915, which saw the first use of gas by the British, but compared to the French offensives, that attack was a mere skirmish by comparison, but had catastrophic losses for the British army. So much so that the Germans actually stopped firing at the attacking British soldiers out of sheer compassion. It was a complete and utter failure for the British. Haig was not willing to make the same mistake at the Somme. He knew that the only way to achieve success on the Western Front was to work with their French allies, like they did at the Battle of the Marne back in 1914. But Britain didn't have the army of France and Germany. Even with their increase in manpower due to the war propaganda on the home front, they still lagged behind and weren't willing to throw their young men into the frying pan in attrition warfare, where the goal was to bleed each other dry, like the French and Germans were doing at Verdun. Great Britain needed France in this battle, but the Germans put a dent in the Allies' plan. So Haig asked for more artillery, 30% of which were duds, and moved the battle up 1 month to July 1st, 1916, to support the French at Verdun sooner. The Somme didn't have a road leading to it like the city of Verdun did. It was in the middle of nowhere, so most supplies had to be brought up by mule. Horses and mules required fodder, so in essence you end up carrying more horse fodder than shells and munitions. Most of the soldiers fighting hadn't previously seen combat. Many were from PALS battalions, which consisted of young men who enlisted back in 1914 with bright-eyed enthusiasm. The sentiment back then for war was overwhelmingly positive. It was considered cowardly if you didn't go, and all hesitation or rejection about joining to do your part was undoubtedly a controversial stance. Many of these young men knew each other from the same schools, workplace, classrooms, towns, neighborhoods, or even household. This was a huge mistake, as villages and towns would have their entire male population wiped out in a single day of fighting. Many young men who fought on the Somme knew each other from before the war, and would all die together, or watch their best friends or brothers perish. In 2016, recently declassified German archives revealed that 2 British soldiers were politically disgruntled and warned the Germans about the attack on the Somme region, and the Germans started bolstering their defenses in the area and attacked at Verdun because of this. Although one thing that the Germans weren't expecting was the tunnels being dug 50 feet below them. The British were digging tunnels behind their lines and all the way through no man's land and underneath the German front lines. Once they were underneath the enemy lines, they would place thousands of mines in a chamber dugout. The mines were set for 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes before 0 hour. The idea was to blow the charges and the troops could rush out of the crater holes and use it as cover. The artillery bombardment would consist of 1,700,000 shells pounding the German lines for a week straight. The intense barrage could be heard as far as London. The objectives were for the British Third Army to make a diversionary attack at Gommecourt. The rest would be at Beaumont Hamel, Thiepval, and Montauban. All had to be taken on the first day alone. At 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, British, Canadian, Anzac, Indian, South African, Caribbeans, and French troops hear the whistle blow and set off into no man's land. The barrage was set to be so intense that all the German defenses, barbed wire, pillboxes, and machine guns would be taken out, and the British would merely just have to mop up the remainders. This was anything but true. Soldiers noted that barbed wire emplacements had not been cut due to a lot of the artillery being duds. One mine also went off too early, and the Germans actually beat the British to the crater since it was closer to their lines. A Newfoundland regiment of over 800 men were completely wiped out by German machine guns when they rushed over to occupy the crater. Most of the German defenders remained unharmed because the Germans spent more time building better defenses than the Allies. Also, the Somme battlefield was rich in chalk, which added an extra layer of protection for the defenders underground, which was where all the Germans were hiding. Barbed wire was set up in a way which funneled the attackers into specific kill zones for the machine guns. Once the attackers were in range, the machine gunners let them have it. Another issue was the type of weaponry that all armies were using. The bolt action rifle was outdated for a war like this. When you're attacking something that is chucking over 500 rounds a minute at you, you need something that can lay down a volume of fire from a single shooter that can almost match the machine gun. Soldiers did have the Lewis gun, but not everyone had one, and usually these weapons were operated by 2 to 3 man crews. Everyone needed to be able to lay down large volumes of fire, not just the few Lewis gunners. They just didn't have the small arm firepower needed to match what they were dealing with. Most soldiers found grenades and pistols more useful than their rifles when raiding a trench. Clubs and shovels were also useful killing tools once enemy soldiers came face to face in the trenches. It was all a failure though. In the south, the Germans believed that there wouldn't be an attack and so spent much less time bolstering their defenses. The French attacked here with 2 divisions and took all their first day objectives, but north of the line was utter destruction. None of the British attackers even came close to their objectives. The British would sustain over 60,000 casualties in the first day alone, with 40,000 being wounded and 20,000 killed in action, making it the bloodiest and worst day in British military history. The Somme was the First World War in a microcosm. The trenches, the mass slaughter of young men, many of which were teenagers, the intense bombardments, the machine guns, the mud, and the futility of this conflict were all wrapped together in this ugly concoction that was the Battle of the Somme. They should have ended the battle right away, but the Battle of Verdun was still raging on, and France needed relief, but Haig still had one more trick up his sleeve, unfortunately. On September 15th, the British would unveil an armored vehicle that would revolutionize modern warfare: the tank. Named tanks so that German intel would just think of them as mobile water tanks, the name stuck. They would be deployed sparsely in front of the infantry, who followed behind as the tanks crushed the barbed wire, leaving a path for the men that followed. They instilled fear into the Germans at first, but were still largely ineffective due to only traveling about 5 kilometers per hour. Lightning fast. The Mark I tank was an easy target for artillery, and tanks would either break down or be trapped in ditches, which would lead to most of the tanks being destroyed that day. Despite the shortcomings, Haig still saw their potential and ordered more to be produced for coming battles. Male and female versions were issued, with the male version having dual cannons on both sides, and the female versions having 4 machine guns on both sides. Both the British and the French would work on new designs as the war progressed. The Mark I series would continue all the way up to the Mark VIIs, and the French would develop the Renault FT, which was the first tank to have a rotating turret, a design feature that would be copied by all future tank designs. The British would learn that sending troops in massive waves was a mistake. Attackers were easy targets for rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Victorian-era tactics had no place in a modern battlefield. Instead, they learned you could send small amounts of troops to cover each other and move up in small blots. A unit would move up and the unit behind them would cover their approach, and the unit behind would approach ahead of the unit they were covering, and rinse and repeat until they reached their objective. Moving in large armies in one line over an open field was slowly being phased out as the war continued and casualties began to mount. The Battle of the Somme would come to a close on November 18th, 1916. Very little ground was gained, and neither side claimed victory. However, the British did succeed in relieving pressure from Verdun for their French allies, so one goal was met. The battle would sustain over 1 million casualties for both sides, making it one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in human history.